Hello, and thank you for joining us for the second in a series of 4 summer energy talks organized by the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. I am Varun Rai. I am director of the UT Energy Institute. Before introducing our topic to you today, let me first give you a glimpse of what's happening next week. The talk next week is on the impact of COVID-19 on transportation patterns and greenhouse gas emissions. And the speaker will be Mary D. Nichols, who is chair of the California Air Resources Board. The discussion today is on supply chain and competitiveness through the lens of COVID-19, and we have Bill Bates, who is Executive Vice President of the Council on Competitiveness. Globally dispersed and interdependent supply chains have underpinned patterns of economic growth and social technical transformations across the world. Globalized supply chains have also rewired the competitive landscape across the world. But within a few months, COVID-19 has ruptured large parts of the global supply chain across sectors, while deeply disrupting both demand and supply throughout, unraveling competitive landscape in its wake. Mention very quickly 3 examples that we all will perhaps relate to. Toilet papers, oil prices going minus 40 for the next month delivery a couple months ago. And of course, sanitizers and masks and related items. These are some of the ways in which it got manifested. In 2007, the Council on Competitiveness released a major report titled Transform, which made the case for resilience in the face of myriad of potential threats to businesses, government, and the US critical infrastructure. Over the past 13 years, the nomenclature of resilience have become commonplace. Yet, the decimating impact of COVID-19 on the US economy and the lack of preparedness by the public and the private sectors is evident that the warnings and recommendations in Transform remain incredibly relevant today. In short, the US knew it was coming and the country still wasn't ready. In particular, the disruption to global supply chain across multiple sectors have laid bare the vulnerabilities to business as usual. From medical supplies to food to household staples, COVID-19 is forcing a reevaluation of government and business of their supply chains. And that's generally the topic of our discussion today. Let me quickly introduce our speaker to you. Bill, as I mentioned, is Executive Vice President of the Council on Competitiveness and was founding Executive Director of the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. Recently, he's led a multi-year initiatives to explore the economic opportunity for advanced manufacturing in the US and the development of national cybersecurity agenda. Bill is Chief Architect of the Council's National Competitiveness Forum, which is an annual C-suite conversation that sets a pro-growth agenda for the US policymakers. He is also a very, very frequent speaker at national and international forum. And last but not least, very importantly, he's also on the board of the UT Energy Institute. So we're very, very pleased, Bill, that you're able to join us. Before we get into the discussion, Bill, do you want to say a few words on additional background about yourself or the council as relevant to the discussion today?
Sure. Thanks so much, Varun, for the invitation and the introduction. Maybe just a moment or two of background about the Council on Competitiveness. Some people may be familiar with, others may not, but we were founded back in 1986 by John Young, the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, and he founded the council after participating in a presidential commission on competitiveness. At the time, the Reagan administration was worried that Japan and Germany were rising economic powers and that the United States was not responding appropriately to that threat. In addition, obviously, we had the ongoing challenge from a national security and military perspective of the Soviet Union at the same time. So he founded, after working on this administration commission, decided that it was a worthwhile project to undertake to bring his peer group together of fellow CEOs, university leaders. He then added in labor leaders and the heads of national labs to create the council, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership group of these key decision makers in private sector organizations. And the overarching mission of the organization is to make sure that there is a private sector voice in public sector policymaking. And that's what we have tried to do over the past 33, 34 years. So obviously things have evolved tremendously since the mid 80s. We're now looking at a situation where China is probably our greatest competitor. And interestingly, and this will relate to the discussion specifically on supply chains, the situation with China is a little different than Japan and Germany, where we were looking at specifically economic competition and not really a military aspect to it. Whereas with China, that line has blurred. And we're now having to deal with a situation where we have a competitor that is both an economic competitor and a national security, defense, military competitor. And that has implications and has had implications, as we will get into, I'm sure, in the next few minutes as we start talking about supply chain issues. Just real quickly, I just wanted to touch on a couple relevant initiatives. You mentioned the energy and manufacturing work that we've done. The transform work, which really originally came out of post 9/11. And the tremendous disruptions that terrorist attack had, and how companies and organizations could begin to think about building security into their competitiveness agenda, as opposed to just looking at it as something that was a cost sink that they had to deal with. So that's an ongoing effort of the organization. We also have a major initiative on innovation to look at the future of US innovation capacity. And if we have a couple minutes later, I can share a little more about that. But for now, I think that sort of sets us up for after a short introduction.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. Let me begin by asking that, COVID-19 has raised the visibility of the challenge about supply chains and thinking about resilience. But supply chain disruptions are not new. We have seen this before, haven't we?
No, and obviously, as I was just, saying with regard to the post 9/11 thought process, that really highlighted that supply chain disruption was something that could be planned for, even if you didn't know what the disaster or disruption might be, and that was really the message that we tried to bring out of that work in the mid 2000s. 2007, 2008. One great example that I always point to is actually post Katrina, another natural disaster situation, which disrupted government supply chains as the government tried to move in and help residents in New Orleans and Louisiana. The one company that was able to move faster than the government was Walmart. And that was because they already had in place a whole set of supply chain redundancies and efficiencies that they were able to utilize in order to get things such as large quantities of water and supplies, medical supplies, to places that the government just wasn't able to do as quickly. So it's really a question of resilience that sort of came to the forefront with that work. And then, as I was looking and preparing for this talk, I came across an article with a headline that basically said, to date, this year is likely to be the most disruptive to supply chains that we've ever seen. And I assumed that article was going to be from a week or two ago about what's been happening now. But in fact, it was from 2018. And the article was really focused, obviously not on pandemic issues, but was focused on a series of factory fires that occurred. And it really highlighted the point that supply chains disruptions, well, this is an extreme case, and we need to talk about what the implications of COVID-19 are to the supply chain. Disruptions to the supply chain have been with us all along here, especially as we've gotten more globalized. They've become more distributed. The margins have narrowed. So things such as tariffs, hurricanes, fires, all can affect supply chains, and this is why it's such a relevant conversation, but really why COVID has not really pointed out some of the challenges with supply chains, but has really brought to the forefront an extreme case. But I think it just really reemphasizes from an organizational and/or government perspective that you can't just push aside and say, well, there's no chance we're going to have another COVID-19, so I don't need to worry about it. We've taken our hit, it's over. these challenges, these issues of disruption to the supply chain could come from any direction. And that's why it's so important to think about it from a resilience perspective. How do I prepare for something without knowing what that something might be?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll stop there, Varun. We can, I'm sure we'll want to get back to some of those points.
Let us link this back to competitiveness. Many of the things you mentioned, Bill, sound like, for example, you took the example of Walmart, and, they did it internally as an organization. Why is this not largely an organizational issue, and why is this, and how is that, for that matter, connected to national competitiveness?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Varun, because it obviously is a company issue. If you can't get the parts you need, if you can't get access to the energy you need, it certainly matters to consumers, as you pointed out early, the infamous run on toilet paper and paper towels, which thankfully seems to have abated somewhat at this point. But it's really becomes a competitiveness issue when you start thinking about the larger healthcare concerns, when hospitals, doctors, medical workers can't get the masks they need, the tests that they need. This strains trade agreements that countries have between each other, which assume and count on a certain flow of goods and services across border. And that in turn can impact sort of the global balance of power, which really gets to a national competitiveness point of view. And obviously, as you pointed out, the price of oil and energy demand has tremendous international implications for both national power and control and value, but also getting into jobs and company viability and things such as that. So it really does sort of ripple out beyond that, or ripple out beyond sort of a individual organization or even individual government issue, because everything is just so linked. And that also gets back to the point I made up front, which is, we're dealing with China specifically, as an example, of a country that we're not only trying to navigate how do we compete from an economic perspective, but how do we deal with them from a national security perspective. And a lot of the supply chains that are tied up in that relationship, it's not always clear whether it's an economic supply chain question or it's a national security question. One quick example, if you think of something that's really an economic product, an iPhone, right? But then there's also implications of strategic national value in the pieces that make up that iPhone. The advanced materials, the microelectronics, all have sort of dual use relevance there. So a disruption to supply chain that you might think of as, oh, that's an Apple problem, could really have implications much broader than that.
Mm-hmm. So if we go back a little bit, Bill, we talked about some of the earlier disruptions to supply chain of different magnitudes. What's so different about the disruption that COVID-19 has caused? You also use the phrase, it's kind of an extreme disruption. What are these attributes?
Yeah, I mean, it really is an extreme disruption, and it's a demand disruption and a supply disruption, which is somewhat unique. You could think about it's not that companies stopped being able to create products. It's that they didn't necessarily have the supply chains that created the products that people suddenly needed. The toilet paper is one example, but let's put that aside and think about just something like a kitchen product, like a can of tomato sauce. You have in your kitchen cabinet somewhere probably an 8-ounce or 16-ounce can of tomato sauce. Well, that's fine, but the company that makes those also makes 3-quart size tomato sauce cans that they sell to restaurants. Well, we shut down all the restaurants. Well, they can't just start selling their 3-quart cans of tomato sauce to you and I. We've got no place to put that, and I don't know who needs that much tomato sauce. So that's just a simple example of not necessarily there suddenly being no access or no product to move, but it's not the right product. And so that really came to the forefront. The other two issues that are so different with COVID is it's global. This didn't just happen somewhere. It didn't, it wasn't a hurricane that hit a vital, oil field or a distribution center in one country, in one region. This happened everywhere. And so that really made it much more difficult for somebody to just say, okay, well, I'll just move, I'll stop getting what I need here and just get it over here. They were able to do some of that because the virus didn't spread to the same places all at the same time, but it did reach almost every corner of the globe. And that was really a unique situation in this case. And then finally, the last thing I just say is it really laid bare this issue around resilience that we talked about at the start, which is that companies, governments, other organizations have been talking about resilience, about being prepared for disruptions. But this I think made clear that they weren't as prepared as they could have or should have been. And you could, and people have argued saying, oh yeah, but who could have seen this coming? True, but you can see something coming. It might not be a pandemic that causes this disruption next time. Maybe it's a series of hurricanes, that hit different spots, or maybe it's a tariff war that gets out of control and completely disrupts supply chains. So I think what we're really seeing is that even though a lot of groups said, okay, yeah, we are focused on resilience, we are ready for something, really the issues around cost savings, efficiencies of supply chains kind of outweighed the resilience side of the equation, and COVID kind of pushed it right over the edge.
Mm-hmm. Let's put some more meat on the bone that you have prepared for the discussion, Bill. How disruptive? Give us some. Figures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned at the start, obviously, not being able to get toilet paper off the shelves or the price of oil, but surveys that have been done talking to companies about how impactful to the supply chain has this really been. The numbers are pretty staggering. 89% of businesses, polled have said that this was a disruption to their businesses and it harmed their bottom line. 44% have said that sales have significantly dropped. 41% say they can't get the components and the parts that they need. Another over 40% say their production times have increased or lengthened. And I think you and I see that, right? I mean, we all got so used to, punching in, clicking on our Amazon or some other online account and having whatever we ordered show up at our front door the next morning. Now when we have to wait a week, it's suddenly a crisis that we don't know how to deal with, that we can't have that instant gratification. But I think that's just a personal example of the disruption into time and supply chains we're seeing. Over 36% of companies surveyed say they've had to lay off employees that they really didn't want to have to lay off. It's not like this was, oh, finally I had an excuse to get rid of Bob because, he's been dragging me down. This is, companies that are really hurting and having to let people go that are valuable players and contributors to their organization. And then finally, about a quarter of companies have said they simply have been unable to fill customer orders. I mean, these are big numbers for the day-to-day operations of organizations. And then if we just, this as well, Varun, and I'm sure you could fill out some of this thoughts, but in the energy sector alone, just the implications around fewer people driving. So there's less demand for gas and oil, sort of interestingly, less electricity is being used. A lot of office buildings aren't open, we're not lighting stadiums like we used to and things like that. And then longer term, I think one of the really sort of scary implications is we're seeing a drop in research investment and in investment in energy technology. And some of that is supply chain issues. Absolutely. People are having trouble getting things, but some of it is, the impact that COVID is having on the ability of people to work and to interact. And I'm sure, at the university, you're seeing the challenges that the research enterprise is having to try and maintain. I don't know if you want to touch on that, because that's really important to these issues. And then the last thing I would just say on the numbers issue is a question of how permanent are these changes? We're unfortunately not in a situation today where we're talking about what happened. You know, we're still talking here 3-4 months into this crisis about what's happening. You know, and PwC did a survey saying basically 64% of energy companies are still worried about a global recession today. You know, 25% their supply chains haven't gotten back to where they need them to be right now. And again, you know, I assume you're hearing similar stories.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bill. And to your earlier point on the research enterprise, certainly it's not been simple or straightforward, right? I mean, initially at the university here and, you know, more broadly elsewhere, you know, we really had to stop a lot of things and then reassess, reevaluate, and you know, move everything that we could remotely. And only for the last month and a half have we brought back a lot of the physical lab-based work after a lot of thought and care, and something that is still evolving, right? And so to your point, you know, it's certainly continues to take a lot of thinking and effort. I'll remind the audience and the attendees to type in their questions in the Q&A box. We'll have plenty of time towards the end to take those. Let's shift gears a little bit, Bill, and talk about the response. And we got a glimpse of, you know, what the companies faced, but what have been the response by companies, but also, you know, by governments, because, you know, you tied this back to competitiveness and also national security. So let's get a glimpse of, you know, how the companies and governments have tried to respond.
Sure, absolutely. And because I think it's such it's an important point, because it's the situation we're in right now is not sustainable. You know, we talked about the companies losing employees. Are those employees going to be there when the company's ready to or wants to hire them back? And on the other side of that same coin, is the company going to be there? You know, margins in a lot of these industries that are being affected are so narrow that increased parts and supplies, increased cost to parts and supplies could really tip a balance sheet one way or the other. And I do worry that there's a wave of sort of hidden bankruptcies that is being sort of covered up by the forced closures and partial reopenings that we're seeing right now, and that this is something that's on the horizon. So the question about what are companies doing to try and to mitigate this is a really important one. What we're seeing is a majority of them are saying that they're revisiting their reliance on countries like China, and they are looking at the US as a potential place to move some of that manufacturing, some of that supply availability. You know, almost 9 out of 10 companies are saying that this has forced them to look at more digital solutions to their supply chains and making that a real priority, with the hope that that can reduce costs, it can increase their visibility to risks that they have with the supply chain. You know, that's the good news. The bad news is only about 1 out of 10 companies say they really understand how to do that digital transition, or that they have the resources and funding in place, which makes sense if you think about, you know, what they're really talking about is putting in place sensing technology, tracking technology, real-time awareness of where things are. I mean, this is a fairly complex system, and one that, sure, maybe, you know, global 500 companies have the capacity and expertise to do, but when you start talking about small and mid-sized businesses, this can be a completely foreign language to folks. Resilience is another area that companies seem again to be saying the right things about. So hopefully that sort of the 3 things of, you know, revisiting, looking at China, looking elsewhere, focusing on digital opportunities to create efficiency and awareness to risks, and then just again a renewed focus on resilience are sort of the 3 tracks that companies are taking to try and respond to this challenge. Governments are in a little different position, right? So the bottom line, to some folks' despair, the bottom line does not matter as much to governments. What matters there is public health, national security, and a lot of policymakers here in Washington are rightly asking the question, how is it we, as the wealthiest nation in the world, don't have enough masks, don't have enough test kits, don't have enough ventilators? Why are we vulnerable and beholden to others in this situation? And that's going to be a discussion that's going to take place for over the next several months and probably years. But I do think we're going to see some significant adjustments by the government here in the US going forward because of the disruptions that we've seen in this COVID situation. Things, we're likely to see greater stockpiles of equipment. We may see some adjustments to the healthcare situation. That's probably a big question dependent on what happens with the presidential election at the end of this year. And I'm not offering predictions there. But I do think that is, that's an issue that if it's a second Trump administration is likely to go in one direction. If it's a Biden administration, you could see it go in a different direction. But the healthcare question is a big one. And I know what you'd wanted me to touch on, and we can do this later, a little bit of what some other countries have done. But I think that's where you see some of the real distinctions in response. And it's that getting the country back up and running quickly, which is a key part of this supply chain mitigation as far as disruptions go. But that's that's kind of what we're seeing from a company and government, at least initial response.
So picking up on a thread you mentioned, Bill, about reshoring or moving of operations out of China and perhaps some of that to the US. From a competitiveness standpoint, is this an opportunity for the US?
It sure should be. No question about that. And you are hearing a lot of people talking about reshoring or looking for other opportunities. Back in April, about 64% of companies across the manufacturing sector were saying that they were looking to move production back to North America, at least, and away from China as a way to sort of mitigate future disruptions. So right then and there, that's a huge opportunity on its face that you would hope we would have pounced on. I'm a little concerned we didn't. And it's not because we thought that was a bad idea. I don't think there was nobody opposed to bringing manufacturing back and reshoring. But when you look at surveys more recent from the, that number I quoted a minute ago was from April. When you look at some surveys from July, suddenly you're seeing now a majority of companies saying, I'm not thinking about that reshoring thing as much as I once was. So I think it's a fair question to sort of ask, was that more of like an abstract conceptual idea that people had sort of off the cuff, or was that a real significant movement to bring things back? It's true that a vast majority are saying they're going to be more cautious going forward about where they outsource, but 75% of people are saying, they may minimize the reliance on China, but they're probably going to continue to have at least a significant part of their outsource and supply chain that runs through that country. And a big part of that is because this didn't turn out to be a 2-month problem. I think a lot of that attitude in April about the opportunity for the US to really bring things back was based on the assumption that, okay, we'll shut things down, we'll get this thing under control. In 2 months, we can reopen things back up, and let's not put ourselves in that situation again that we were just in. But we're not there. We're still basically in large measure shut down. Yes, hopefully we're going to see a vaccine sometime before the end of the year, but no guarantees. So I think from an organizational standpoint, a company standpoint, they're looking at the situation and saying, well, I've got to operate. China's back up and running. Large parts of Europe are back up and running. So I'm going to take advantage of that. It's concerning that that we may have missed a window of opportunity for the country to really jumpstart some of the manufacturing that we have here. It's not like this is starting from scratch. We've got tremendous assets here on the ground, and I won't belabor the point. We may have let that one slide by.
So we'll come back to that one again, but maybe shed some light on is this the same as to how Germany, Japan, Korea, South Korea, and other countries may have addressed and interacted with the set of issues and opportunities?
Yeah, it's. I mean, obviously, different countries are in different situations, and but I don't think it was inevitable. I think if you look at a country like Germany and sort of ask, okay, what were some key differences that made them able to bring this under control, at least to the point where their operations are up and running a little better than they are here. And some of it is just a different focus on key issues like healthcare. Germany has universal healthcare. Germany has the most hospital beds in Europe per person, per thousand people. They've got testing capacity relative to their per capita that's tremendous compared to other countries. It's a very user-friendly system that encourages people to take advantage of it, so that it gave them the capacity to, when they said to people, we have to get our populace tested, we need to know where the risks are, that was fairly easy to do. Whereas here we had a kind of a ramp up period. So that, that I think, put us sort of a little bit behind the curve. Now, obviously, we weren't going to suddenly institute universal health care overnight here in the United States. And I don't think that anybody is suggesting that we institute a Chinese government-like top-down, political system here in the United States. So there are cultural differences that are not easy to fix overnight. But the result of it is that the result of that is it has been shown that it's possible to do. We just have to figure out here in this country how, within our system and the divisions that we have, and the, let's be honest, certain distrust that people have for institutions of government and others, that we, to find a way over that, because we're missing the economic opportunity as a result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so much has happened, right? We have been in this situation in many parts of the world over 6 months, and in the US, over 4 months now. Has this made any dent in how we may be thinking about the longer term situation? What's the longer term outlook? Are you optimistic about any real change that is going to happen to supply chains?
I'd like to be more optimistic than I'm probably coming across as here today. I just emphasize what I said a few minutes ago, which is that, we're not done with this yet. I wish we were talking about lessons learned, here in almost August, but we're not. We're still having to grapple with the challenges and the problems that we have. I think we're already starting to see a lot of companies go back. It's probably too much to say to go back to the way things were, but they're definitely sort of, I think, moving towards back to, they're going back to a gamble that this isn't going to happen again soon, and that they can sort of restart, reload the supply chain, engaging countries all over the world, and hope that it's not going to be, we're not going to have to shut everything down again, or this is going to flare up in a bad way, or that there's going to be some other disruption, like many that we've talked about. It does seem like, instead of sort of embracing the opportunity that we sort of heard a lot about in the March-April timeframe of bringing things back, of looking at alternatives, instead of outsourcing something, was there an opportunity to partner with a 3D printing company and make what you need here, or on the fly, or in your own facility nearby, or just some sort of an innovative solution, to that. To institute greater resilience. I hope companies will institute greater resilience, because something else is going to happen. We've had disasters happen. We've had horrible hurricanes. We've had a terrorist attack. We've had a pandemic. If you go and look at the report that you referenced of ours, Transform, we list a paragraph full of things that could disrupt the way we do business and the way our supply chains operate. Doesn't predict or say we know which one it's going to be, but it's pretty clear that something is going to happen. So we need to see that refocus. So I guess if I'm pessimistic perhaps in the short term that people are going to look for to get up and running in the easiest way possible, and the easiest way possible is to go back to the way things were done before. I'm a little more optimistic in the longer term sort of resilience that companies, governments will take a look at this situation and not want to be the one that gets caught, without the supplies, the facilities, the processes in place that are necessary to be responsive and to get back up and running quickly the next time this has happened. And we had a call on this topic with our board maybe a month into the pandemic. And one of the folks on the board said something which I thought was really insightful. He said, when these crises happen, the conventional wisdom is that it's going to take 12 to 18 months to get back to normal or back up and running. He said, but there's absolutely no reason that has to be the conventional wisdom. We need to be thinking about how do we shorten that time period. And when I say we, I mean, we, the CEO of a company, we, the United States, we, the president of a university. What can we put in place today that next time this happens, it's a 6-month, hiccup instead of a 2-year, something that blows up into a bigger and bigger crisis.
Mm-hmm. Let me push forward one of the strands you mentioned, the short term versus the long term. And for example, I mean, one of the reasons why companies would in the short run try to just go back to what they're doing is just the sheer cost competitiveness and the aspect of efficiency, right? And 2 or 3 decades ago, here in this country, we stopped talking about industrial policy, right? And some of the things you mentioned in terms of focus on manufacturing and emphasis on local supply chains, those things have aspects and attributes that are very important, not just from the cost perspective. There are the considerations beyond just cost and economics of what the end product is. So what are your thoughts on some specific ways in which governments should consider thinking about local supply chains and adding more attributes beyond just the sheer efficiency on costs?
Right. I mean, the central premise of our report was that security, that resilience shouldn't be viewed as a cost, much like investments in R&D shouldn't be viewed as a cost. It's an investment. It's an investment in your company's future. It's an investment in your ability to get back up and running faster than your competitor. And that was the concept that we really tried to put forth, was to try and break through that sense that, to your point, do I have to really spend, X, Y, and Z? Do I have to put in place a cyber plan that guarantees that I can't be hacked? What are the chances I'm going to get hacked? What am I going to do? What are the chances that the hurricane's going to come ashore where my facility is versus, 200 miles to the north? But the idea and that's all. And sure, somebody's probably going to get lucky. But what we really tried to emphasize, and where I think the government can play a role, but I also think it's really a private sector led focus, is this willingness to take the steps now that enable you to respond to any potential disruption. And that's the resilience that's not a cost, but it's a competitive advantage. Because you're the first, you're the first company that's supply chain is back up and running, that's factory is back up and running, that's doors are open, because you thought about that. And sure, yeah, it's no doubt a balance. Varun, obviously you're not going to bankrupt the company to make sure that there's no possible disruption that could ever happen to you. But I think that there is a willingness to roll the dice, that the odds are that something isn't gonna happen, and there's got to be a balance in there somewhere. And I think what COVID has shown to us is that we didn't have the balance quite right. We need to move the line a little bit more towards the resilient side of the equation, and a little less towards the God, I hope nothing bad happens to me side of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I do think, and I think the other thing, just from a government standpoint, to get to your point of, okay, what can we do? I mean, I think the government is looking into some critical issues around the future of advanced microelectronics. That has a national security and an economic value to our country that's tremendous. And, we don't make many of those here in the United States anymore. So when the supply chain gets disrupted, we don't have anything to fall back on here. Rare earth materials is another great example. China controls almost 90% of the market for rare earth materials, and those are critical to everything that we do that uses electronics. We wouldn't be having this conversation today if we didn't have access to those materials. And again, that's a disruption to that supply chain would have tremendous economic and national security implications. So, if I'm king of the government for a day, those are areas that I think, okay, we've got to make some investments and plans so that we're prepared to deal with any disruptions in areas such as that are critical both to our economy and to our ability to operate and defend ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And we have a few questions, so let's start pivoting there, and I'll remind attendees again, please, if you have questions, type them into the Q&A box. We are collecting those, and Carrie King will read those out for Bill, and Bill, you could go ahead and directly address those. And while Carrie gets ready with the first question we would like to get to you, Bill, maybe you have any closing final thoughts on the discussion so far?
No, I mean, I think I pretty much threw those into my last comment there. It's really I'm hopeful that this will be a lesson in resilience, and that we're going to see a greater focus on that topic and on that issue, both nationally and organizationally. I think that's the way that we prepare for these crises that we're seeing here. And I think nobody's smart enough to know what the next crisis is. So there's no point in preparing for that specifically, but there's a lot of things that a company, a university, a nonprofit like the council, a country can do to prepare for almost any crisis. And I hope we are learning the lesson that we can do better than we did this time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bill. We have about 15 or so minutes for Q&A. So Carrie, over to you.
Right, thank you. So given what you just said, Bill, there's a couple of questions along those lines. I'll ask the first one.
Okay.
Wait for you to answer. Essentially surrounding the area of the competitiveness or resilience of companies versus the competitiveness or resilience of the country, the United States in general. So earlier in the talk, you said the bottom line, quote, does not matter as much to government. And we should consider, how should we consider that company bottom lines are perhaps the wrong or incomplete metric that has been pursued in the United States besides some other metric that's more country focused? So it's a country versus company type question in bottom lines.
Sure, and I think that's absolutely right. And there are certainly many other issues as are being highlighted in the, in any news channel you happen to turn on today that go beyond just the bottom line for companies or a question of resilience for disaster. That there's several priorities that a company has to balance and manage, and hopefully they are. But specifically from a company's perspective, it is, I fully acknowledge, it is a balancing issue. You can't try to make your company resilient against anything and everything. That's an impossibility. But there are best practices. There are certainly best practices, for example, in the area of cyber protection. We did a lot of work on that a couple of years ago, and just the simplest things that you think of for how to protect your company against a cyber disruption or attack. A lot of places just don't do it because they want to roll the dice, or to be fair, they don't have the expertise and knowledge. If you're a small, mid-sized company, not many of those, not many 50-person or companies have a full-time cyber person on staff that's worried about intrusions or cyber safety and cyber hygiene in the organization. So it is a balancing act for companies. But I think what we really tried to show and demonstrate, and the report had a number of case studies in it. Some of them are pretty dated at this point in time, so I don't want to highlight those specifically, but did have a number of case studies of how companies had made the investment in a manner and sold that investment to shareholders, customers, and executives, that by preparing for and having the ability to get back up and running if something disrupts their supply chain, if something disrupts their operations, was a valuable and monetizable advantage for them vis-a-vis other organizations that weren't making that investment.
Right, thank you.
Sure.
Given your mention of shareholders, perhaps this next question is a good one. Why is the stock market doing well, given what you said earlier in the talk about companies struggling with productivity and jobs, wondering if employees are going to come back after if they've laid them off and they want to bring them on? So I guess this gets alongside of company versus country metrics again, but yeah, is there anything you have to say on the different stakeholders in these processes?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be talking to you from my private jet instead of my home office here. I have no idea why the stock market does what it does. It's if best guess is that there's still a lot of optimism that that we're going to get this thing under control sooner rather than later. The only other thing that's kind of an interesting result of the impact of COVID is, for some companies this has been a boon. If you're a restaurant, it's a horrible situation, but if you're Uber Eats or Amazon or any number of sort of online operations, if you're Zoom or GoToMeeting, this has not been a disaster for you from a corporate perspective. So I think there are certainly companies that you could make the case, deserve that investment that you're seeing from shareholders and investments. But the larger question of why the market goes up, goes down, it's as much a mystery to me as anybody.
I'll just add one other point. It has been a baffling thing. More recently, there's been some discussion and thought around this. One of the aspects is, as the market structure and the smaller firms and the medium firms are in particular taking the bigger hit, it also has an implication of where things emerge after we are out of this in 12 months to 2 years or so, and what happens to the larger firms getting potentially a bigger chunk of the market, given some of the competitive landscape has been disrupted. That, coupled with what you just mentioned, Bill, in terms of what are the major stock indices composed of, and those companies more likely than not have seen more corporate opportunities in this environment. So it's in a way it's not really fully reflective, and not fully reflective actually, and it's divergent from a lot of the real hard day-to-day impact that we're seeing in our personal lives, but also more on the smaller medium businesses.
Yeah, and not to sidetrack us into a macroeconomic conversation that nobody signed up for here, but it's also clear that the Fed and has basically said that they're going to backstop almost anything at this point in time, which I think has given us a level of confidence to investors that has given enough of a level of confidence to investors for them to keep putting money in the market.
All right, so maybe that goes nicely into this next question. You sort of touched on this earlier, so maybe you could just see if you have things to follow up. Essentially, the U.S. sort of current form of capitalism, if you will, current form of our sets of policies and rules versus other countries that you say have different types of forms of government and relations between private and public sector, China or Western Europe. So how resilient in this sense is the US current form, and should we be rethinking about what the public sector does versus what the private sector does?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating for an overthrow of the government or anything. I do think there are some natural challenges that we have with the way we're set up to respond to a crisis that is really global in scope, certainly national in scope. And you're seeing that as different states are responding differently to the virus and the way that they're reopening, not reopening, requiring masks, not requiring masks. And that's just our federalist form of government that we've set up. I do, as I said, earlier, I do think that what happens in the presidential election it is likely to have impacts on a number of these issues that we've talked about here in the last 50 minutes or so. It's just looking at the platforms of the two candidates and some of the ideas that Senator Biden has proposed and some of the issues that President Trump has talked about wanting to focus on in the next 4 years. There's a pretty big divergence there. So if you're one who thinks we need to have a healthcare system more akin to Germany or Italy or somebody like that, or England, then I think you would like to see a Biden presidency. If you believe that the capital system will figure it out and it's a state by state issue, then that's more likely what you're going to see in a second Trump term. So it's there's no question that the responses and the ability to manage the virus, which, to bring us back to our topic today, has direct relationships and implications for supply chains, and where companies and others feel comfortable reaching out and bringing materials and equipment in and having things assembled, there are implications for that. And there's no question that some countries have responded more quickly and more aggressively and more successfully. I don't think you can argue that. Wherever you want to place blame is a different question, but it's why there's no easy answer to the bigger question of how do we prevent this from happening again from a country perspective, beyond some of the topics that we've talked about. And the whole point, I think, of this conversation is sort of demonstrated that it's not one silver bullet solution. It's you can't really say, okay, if we just did X, then we'll be in a better position should something like this ever happen again. It's really a multifaceted attack that needs to be taken, that involves investment in new research and new technology, education, healthcare. There's a lot of pieces to this equation, as well as some of the resilience discussions we've had regarding organizations.
All right. So the next one, it follows on it good from that as well. I'll ask these two questions, which are related to essentially planning for resilience or supply chains. One is, does gender diversity play any part, and has your organization looked at this in terms of who's doing the planning and who's involved in companies or organizations? And the second part is, do you have your top few items or examples of things that you think might be important for innovation for resiliency? You kind of mentioned some sector type areas there, but are there any specific items that you know of or think would be good for resilient planning for supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, on the first question around gender diversity, certainly, as I mentioned at the start that we have a major initiative at the council right now looking at U.S. innovation capacity and how we can enhance U.S. productivity generally. And that's a really broad undertaking, touching on talent issues, technology issues, our infrastructure, the regulatory scheme, tax. A big part of that discussion is on not just gender diversity, but inclusion issues in general. And I think that is a huge piece of the equation. To throw a sports analogy out, we're not playing with our full team right now. And that's a hindrance to our competitiveness and to our ability to grow as an economy and create new value, new ideas, et cetera. So that is a big part of our conversation at the council right now, and looking for ways to really increase inclusion and diversity in the innovation process. And that goes all the way from the university side to labor to the corporate side. So thank whoever raised that. Thank you for doing that. Really important issue and one that we are very focused on. Not something, just to close the loop on that, was not something that that was a big part of the discussion on the resilience and discussion, 13 years ago or so. And that's probably a mistake on our part. And then Carrie, I think there was a second question there, and I don't actually.
Yeah, do you have specific items in terms of innovations that can be developed for resiliency? Is there any specific things that you?
Yeah, I guess I just go back, real quickly to the couple of things I talked about. I think there are, certainly from a government perspective, the obvious ones like making sure we have enough testing capacity, equipment, masks, things like that we, now seems in hindsight obvious. So that's, I would expect we'll solve that problem. That's should be fairly straightforward. I think the more complicated one is on the question of our sort of industrial capacity here in the United States, and how are we going to handle issues related to the future of microelectronics. That's that was really, our game. It was our game. For a while, we were worried in the 80s. That was one of the issues with vis-a-vis competitiveness with Japan. We thought they were taking over the semiconductor industry. So, we put together Semitech. The country kind of came together, the government came together with the private sector to really try and bring that capacity back to the US. And now we're kind of in a situation again where we're at risk of losing that capability. And it's so central to everything that we do and the way we work and operate today that's a big risk. So, that's an area I hope we're going to see greater investment in. You've seen initiatives announced recently, around AI, quantum, some of these newer technologies, certainly 5G, a lot of conversations there. From a technology perspective, I think those are the right ones that we should be focused on and wanting to make sure the US has capacity and ability to lead and to innovate in those areas. And then there certainly are, more obscure, smaller issues like the, rare earth material one I mentioned. It seems like a small issue that shouldn't be that difficult to solve, but those materials only show up in certain places. There's a reason they're called rare. But that doesn't mean that there aren't synthetic opportunities that could be developed, evolved. That's a longer term research investment. And just to put a quick plug in for it, that's why the federal investment in scientific research is so very, very important to our ability to compete long term here in the US.
Okay, we got another one here we might close with. So you talked about reshoring earlier. So this one's along those lines. Someone specifically asking about Mexico, say, as compared to China. You mentioned North America reshoring. So maybe generally, what's the difference between reshoring North America versus reshoring the United States?
I mean, it's, again, proximity is a key player. Obviously, we have a trade agreement with Mexico and with Canada, just recently renegotiated. So, I think the advantage there is there's less things that could go wrong. There's less risk from a geopolitical standpoint. Obviously, it would be great to have everything come within the borders of the United States, but there are ancillary benefits to any kind of increase in North America economic growth and capacity. So, those are the main differences. I mean, as I said, I think the really interesting geopolitical relationship we haven't figured out yet is whether we're dealing with China as an economic competitor or a military competitor. And obviously it is both. But I think our sort of systems and structures that we have in place are sort of designed to deal with countries as one or the other in a lot of ways. And this is a really different and unique circumstance that we're having to have to navigate. And the universities are right in the middle of this as well, as as they deal with a large number of foreign students and visa issues and things like that.
On that profound note, Bill, I'd really like to thank you for joining us. Thank you to all the attendees for being with us. And that brings us to the conclusion of this session. See you next week. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.